Thank you. And thank you for including me in the interview process. A couple of comments and a question. First comment, it is true that I would like to see the nasty stuff removed when it can be safely done, but I don't believe we are remotely there, either with a transportation system or with a destination.
Mm-hmm.
My other comment is when I see huge turbines treated as synonymous with wind energy, I see the need for deep alternatives analysis because there are emerging technologies for harvesting wind energy that don't involve spinning blades that knock birds out of the sky. And just because something is alternative energy doesn't mean it doesn't have environmental impact. And that leads to the question, everything on land, the lead CEQA agency is the County of San Luis Obispo, the San Luis Obispo County Supervisors. Who would be the CEQA lead agency for an offshore wind project? Would it be under CEQA? Would it be under NEPA? How far, depending on how far it would be out? And how would the public be able to engage in the process?
I can answer that question a little bit for you, Eric, regarding the CEQA and the NEPA. I'm not fully clear on the aspects of the offshore bit. I know that the entire decommissioning process is covered both under NEPA and CEQA and has to go through both federal and state environmental reviews as a process itself. And within CEQA, that involves the whole of a project, the entire project scope definition. So if a future proposed wind energy collection farm were to be proposed as part of the future decommissioning of the lands, then that would be included under CEQA as part of the whole of the project.
Thank you. In a way that makes sense because it would be part of the project and you don't like to segment projects. So that makes a kind of sense, but I realize we're kind of in a regulatory weird zone there.
Eric, if I could answer that question for you.
Yes, please.
So if we're talking about offshore wind, we're talking about the Bureau of Energy Management, Boeing. So we're talking about Department of Interior, and we're talking about the federal regulations. So we're dealing with the offshore wind farm is going to be more than 15 miles off land, and that's past California coastal waters. So we get into federal regulations at that point. So
you're basically saying it would be a separate application under a separate process.
And really the only connection that Diablo has with that is the transmission system. So the only transmission lines for the offshore wind is in Diablo Canyon or at the Morro Bay Power Plant. And if they were to split it half and half, you know, that's quite a lot of transmission. I forget the exact numbers, but I do have them documented somewhere. In the future, I can get that to you.
Thank you. By the way, an amazing, amazing presentation. You have all digested tremendous amounts of dizzying information, and obviously this is going to be one of the most consequential decisions our Board of Supervisors has ever made. It's going to take both a lot of work with all segments of the public and a lot of technical knowledge, some of which is not yet even known.
This is Bruce Severance. I just wanted to add to respond to Eric's question that, you know, there is already a proceeding or a working group going with the California Energy Commission, and Commissioner Karen Douglas is chairing that effort, and there are multiple different stakeholders from fisheries to Navy to biodiversity groups that are already engaged in feasibility studies. And there's a vast amount of background information EIRs, et cetera, that are already being conducted on offshore wind feasibility regarding overlays of where the wind farms would be located. And there's probably far more grid capacity than we may be able to put wind generation out on the ocean, just from the standpoint of the amount of available ocean area for the wind generators. And on your comment about wind generators killing birds, the type of wind generators that they're looking at putting in are fairly large scale. That's where you get much larger economies of scale with offshore wind. If you're going for the like 400-foot towers, it's been prototyped in Portugal and now at Block Island in Rhode Island. And they're doing these all over the East Coast. And I consider myself a rabid, environmentalist and climate change mitigation person. I've been involved in advocacy on this for 30 years and in green technology for 30 years. And I think the climate change crisis, the climate crisis is so significant at this point that we really have to look at it in terms of, relatively small near-term environmental impacts that should be mitigated as carefully as possible. But the larger piece of just how offshore wind helps solve the grid harmonization problems and the alternatives being solar plus batteries is not a very good alternative. Lithium-ion batteries have really significant life cycle costs. My understanding is that the carbon footprint content of lithium-ion batteries requires 5 years of use in order to pay back the carbon footprint of the manufacturing of them. And there's really no, at this point, there's really no mass recycling infrastructure for them to recapture the lithium. The major countries that produce it are Chile, Australia, China, places that are fairly far away. So the raw lithium has to be transported long distances. So in my mind, it's very important to look at the relative life cycle cost impacts of these kind of systems approaches to mitigating climate. And offshore wind is really favorable. And I realize it may disrupt some portion of seafloor somewhere. It may, there's going to be some impacts that need to be mitigated as well as possible. And I still think that the overall benefits far outweigh the near-term impacts when we look at that technology.
Obviously, that goes to the findings of overriding considerations, and I agree with you about the lithium. The extraction of it is usually happening in arid areas, and like in Chile and Bolivia, indigenous people are losing access to their water supply because of lithium mining right now. That said, anchoring to the seafloor shouldn't be necessary. That's a major impact, and I know that some designs use floating towers, but I certainly don't believe we can simply ignore the environmental impacts of any size turbine. And I do want to see full full alternatives analysis of ways of harvesting the wind that don't involve huge turbines spinning through the sky. There are major migrations of birds such as wedge-tailed shearwaters way out in that pelagic environment. And so they're definitely, just because human beings are used to consuming a lot of power, we shouldn't just assume that other creatures who have already paid for it many, many, many times over have to keep paying for it.
Thank you so much for your comments, Eric. We would like to open it up again for any of our other stakeholders who haven't gotten a chance to speak yet. Any comments, questions?
I have a question. I know that's something that we talked about this morning, and then something that also happened with like my personal EDES project was that when the quarter is over, the project just kind of dissolves. If you were to pitch this to the next group of EDES students to continue the project, what do you think the next steps would be?
Absolutely. Does somebody else want to talk about that, or I can? Okay.
Are you all graduating?
So some of us are and some of us are not. I'm graduating a fall of this upcoming year.
I'll be here another year.
I'm graduating next winter.
I'm graduating. Yeah, and I are graduating.
So
Yeah.
some of us will be, but some of us won't. I think the goal of what our next step ideally would be and what we kind of want to set it up for our posterity packet is to be able to provide these infographics and all of this research in a kind of streamlined way, be able to provide these infographics to all of our stakeholders, distribute them to them so they may use them in their own work, as well as hopefully, if we were pitching this project to a next group, ideally it would be for them to go ahead and make a website that is a independent entity of PG&E or any of the stakeholders, just presenting all of this information in a very factual way, and hopefully allowing for some of these infographics to be like interactive. That's why we kind of set them up, and especially mine, I set mine up to be able to pull all the layers out. So you could put it on a website and click the different things to get taken to pages. And so we're kind of setting it up in a way for someone else to go ahead and make a website that can be kind of a great compilation of all this information.
Yeah, and we have a lot of information that we've gathered right now in a just sort of drive folder. So this contains all the information from our interviews, collections from research through publicly published information on websites. This would all be passed down, and we do intend for a lot of these documents that we've produced, you know, these diagrams and things to be living documents. So, for example, if you have an amendment to make to this, a coalition to add, or perhaps once we find information on, for example, where Gavin Newsom or like other stakeholders stand on these positions, those could be added through time. And if some of these things start to change too, then those can be amended as well.
I'd like to just jump in there and say that we'd like to have some of this information for our website to help our website editor go in the direction, because this has just come up. So we only found out about the tribal lands transfer policy back in December, and then it seemed like the whole world like fell apart a couple of months later, and now you know, things are getting back on track, and so we can focus more on getting back to you know, how things you know, people were meeting and discussing this, and then everything kind of just stopped for like 6 months. So it'd be great to have this information that we could disseminate on our website to people. And I really liked the summary that Jennifer, you did of our conversation. I would say that that was a great summary.
Yeah, you guys have really digested, as someone said, a dizzying amount of information, and I think as a goal of presenting it to kind of make it clearer for people, the maps, the diagrams, the one-page synopses of conversations are just great. I mean, I feel like I know so much more about the project now. I'm interested in the critical path, the power path of how decisions will ultimately be made. And thank you, Ellia, for the your soliloquy about CEQA and those processes. It seems to me that a lot is going to be in the lap of the County Board of Supervisors. And so therein lies the rub, and everyone has to be aware that they have very, very important roles, and we got to participate in elections to make sure they're representative of all of our views. And then the other aspect is the feds apparently now have a bigger stake in the talk about the offshore potential. And so figuring out ways to get some of those people to talk to each other is going to probably be important. And for voters and us to be able to understand